The floor is yours. You will be talking about 30, 40 minutes, and then we open up the session for Q&A, so we can let our participant ask you a few questions. Please go ahead.
Very good. Thank you, Ricardo. I think you might have to turn down. That's it. Very good. Yes, I got a bit of feedback there. Good evening, everybody. So nice to see you from Singapore. As Ricardo said, my name is James Crabtree, and I'm going to talk for about half an hour about public communications, which really means how do governments communicate with their people. So, and I'm going to show you some slides. So hopefully this will have some nice pictures. So we'll go here. There we go. Now, Ricardo, give me a thumbs up if you can see this picture. Very good. Excellent. So the title that I chose for this talk was Everybody Must Wear a Mask. And I'll explain why I picked that title in just a minute. But it relates to something that happened here in Singapore in the early stages of the pandemic. You can see the picture there of somebody wearing a mask. But in a sense, mask wearing sums up some of the dilemmas of public communications in the pandemic, because it is a kind of a good example of the sort of behavior change that governments need to undertake. But let me explain that in just a minute. So this is my background. So as Ricardo says, I used to work in the British government, but I was also a journalist for a long time. And so in a sense, the intersection between politics and communication has always interested me. I'm not really an academic myself, but I've followed this and watched what governments have been doing, particularly here in Asia. And that's one of the arguments that I want to make this evening, that there's quite a lot that we can learn from how Asian governments have operated in thinking about how to improve public communications, in particular, potentially in countries like Kazakhstan. So I want to do three things this evening in the half an hour that I'm going to speak. So firstly, I want to talk about why we should care about policy communications. Why does it matter? Secondly, I want to look at some communications innovations from here in Asia. What have Asian countries been doing that is interesting? And I think there has been quite a lot that's been interesting that's been coming out of this part of the world at a time in which many of the more traditionally admired Western countries have actually been doing a pretty poor job of government communication during the pandemic. And then I want to conclude by talking a little bit about the ongoing dilemmas of public communication and why it's so difficult. I mean, this is not an easy thing to grapple with. And there remain a number of things that we find very difficult about this. So this is why I chose the title of the talk. So if you lived in Singapore at the very beginning of the pandemic and you read the Straits Times, the national English language newspaper, at the beginning of the pandemic, every day you would have seen that advert on the left-hand side, which says, do not wear a mask. It's qualified, do not wear a mask if you are well, meaning it's okay to wear it if you're sick. But basically the Singaporean government advice in the beginning of the pandemic was you don't need to wear a mask. The evidence suggests they make no difference. And so people didn't wear a mask. I mean, in the early stages of the pandemic, almost nobody in Singapore wore a mask. And then about halfway through the pandemic, the government completely changed its advice. And the advice is now everybody has to wear a mask all the time. And what was interesting about that wasn't so much why they changed their mind, although that was quite interesting. It was how effective they managed to get at everybody to change their mind. So whereas many countries have changed their advice about mask wearing and haven't managed to succeed to get more people to wear a mask, in Singapore, they changed the advice and in a sense, many people complied. And there are lots of reasons why that might be, but I think one of the reasons is simply the effectiveness of the government's communication strategy, in addition to the fact that they have a kind of background of trust with citizens. And that it made me think about, so what is it that you have to do to try and get people to change their behavior in these ways, to wear a mask, to social distance, to stay inside if you're told to stay inside, potentially to get people to do this without resorting to having to fine everybody or get the police involved, which is much more difficult to do. And so that was what got me thinking about this. Just give me 1 second. Forgot that I was going to start my 30-minute timer, so just so I don't go too far over time. And so, yes, so this was, everybody should wear a mask. So how did we get there? And out of that, I want to make 3 sort of main arguments over the course of this presentation. The first of which is that all governments, even the best governments, have really struggled to work out how to use public communications effectively during the pandemic. And I'll talk a little bit about a couple of reasons why public communications is not only hard, but has got much, much harder over the last 5 or 10 years compared to when I was working for the British Prime Minister, and certainly in the decade prior to that. The second argument I want to make is that actually many Asian states have underlined a shift from being way behind the pace on areas of public communication to one of the world leaders. And if you look at this picture here of this happy dog, this rather charming little dog in the middle graphic, I'll come back to him and why he's relevant to this story as a kind of example of public communication innovation. And then the third argument is about the dilemmas that governments still face, and in particular, what I think of as the balancing of openness against authority, which I think is really the central dilemma that faces governments as they try and work out how to communicate in situations like a pandemic, but not exclusively this pandemic, in situations that are complex, where the government doesn't really know what's going on or doesn't have full access to information, and the decision-making process is very complicated. I think balancing openness and authority is really the hardest thing that governments have to do. So those are the 3 sort of arguments that I want to get to. So you might be thinking, okay, well, what is public communication? Why do we care about that? So in a sense, this is how governments used to think about public communication, which is that so many of you at a School of Public Policy will either be policymakers or you're going to get jobs as policymakers. And it used to be that there was a sort of 2-step process in which there were people who did policy, who made public policy. They had the important jobs and they made the policy, they decided what it was, and then they handed it over to a group of other people whose job it was to do the communication. They were the sort of public relations people, and they would go out and brief newspaper journalists and try and get things on the television news. And so for a long time in the broadcast era, that was really how we thought about public communications. It was a kind of PR job. But I think that is now a rather unhelpful way of thinking about public communications, unhelpfully narrow. It still exists, but it doesn't really give the full sense of why public communication matters so much. Indeed, in the beginning of the pandemic, I remember talking to one of the lead civil servants in Singapore, talking about the challenges that the government here faced during the pandemic, where he said, basically, public communication was the single most important thing that the government had to do during the pandemic. And so rather than it being a job for a small group of press officers, it was fundamental to the government's ability to achieve its objectives as the pandemic continued. And so you can see here, why that matters. So this is a quote from the Brookings Institution, the American think tank, talking about what is policy communications. And they say policy communications can be thought of as informing citizens of the existence of a policy, 1, and then persuading them to participate or comply with the policy requirements, 2. And that sounds sort of deceptively simple, but if you think about it, there are all sorts of ways in which government policies actually go beyond that, and many modern problems are not simply the result of telling people that the government has a policy, but they involve trying to get the government to trying to get people to change their minds. So if you think about climate change, for instance, is a very obvious example where we're not going to be able to solve the problems of climate change without significant behavior change in all of our lives. If you think about obesity, the government can, raise taxes on sugary drinks, and it can, to some degree, ban you from eating certain types of food. But typically, we think of obesity and related problems as something that requires behavior change from the population. The same is true with all sorts of elements of aging and elder care. One of the biggest problems facing the healthcare needs of elderly people is that they are prescribed medicines that they don't take. And so an awful lot of effort in public communication goes into just simply getting people to take their medicine, because that's the best way of improving healthcare outcomes. It's also true in areas like vaccination, which are going to become a huge issue for all countries soon. Namely, are the vaccinations that you're being asked to take, are they safe? Have they been properly accredited? Are there any risks associated with them? And we've seen the rise of anti-vaccination movements, which have, in a sense, followed on from a failure in public communication. And so I said earlier that one of the things I wanted to talk about is, why has this got so much harder? Why is it difficult to communicate with the public? Well, I would point to two things that have changed over the last decade very dramatically. These are fairly obvious things, but it's worth pointing them out anyway. The first of which is that trust in political institutions in most countries, certainly in the Western world, and there's good evidence of this in parts of Asia, that trust is declining in political institutions pretty much across the board, while technology use clearly is increasing or changing very substantially. The tools that we use, holding up my phone here, the tools that we use to communicate, to learn about the world have changed dramatically, particularly amongst the young. So to take that latter point first, it's very obvious, but nowadays most people get most of their news from social media, and that is particularly true amongst younger citizens, and it's actually particularly true in emerging markets. So in sort of poorer emerging markets, as you have in parts of Asia, in middle-income countries like Kazakhstan, actually the more people rely on their mobile phones, and the more of a leap it has been from the old world of communication to the new world of mobile phones, actually the more dramatic this change has been. So a country like India or Myanmar, in some ways feels this change more dramatically than a country like France or Japan. So all of you will be quite familiar with that. The second point about trust is slightly less obvious. I mean, the data that I'm showing you here is from the United States, but there's comparable data from many other countries as well. So trust in government has declined, trust in political leadership has declined, but also trust in a whole range of institutions, from the church through to the professions. So trust in judges has declined. And we think that this is bad, but it's a rather more complicated picture than that. So the way that I often ask my students to think about this is, think about what happens when you go to visit a doctor. And in my parents' generation, they didn't really have much choice. If you started to feel unwell, then you went to see a doctor, and the doctor told you, they listened to what your symptoms were, and then they told you what was wrong with you, and they told you what was going to happen next. Nowadays, if you go to see the doctor, then typically what happens is you Google your symptoms, you Google your likely route of treatment, so you figure out what's wrong with you and what you'd like to have happen, and then you arrive at the doctor with all of this information, and you want to have a conversation with the doctor in which you want the doctor to listen to you, and typically you may want them to defer to what you have to say. And that's a very profound change in the nature of the relationship between citizens and the state. Hang on, I think I might just have lost my screen sharing for a minute, so I'm just going to stop for 1 second. Where has this gone? Come here. There we go, we're back. Sorry, excuse me. Just going to share the screen. There we go, we're back. It's a very profound change in the relationship between citizens and institutions, in which there's much less deference than there used to be. And in many ways, that's a good thing. It means citizens are empowered, citizens have opinions about things, but it means that if you are a doctor or a judge or a public policymaker or a politician, then people are much less likely to take on trust what you say and to do what you say in an unquestioning way. It's just a much more complicated relationship. And you also see this, for instance, in the way that recent political trends in the West. So in the British Brexit referendum. This was perhaps the most famous phrase in the British Brexit referendum, which was that citizens had had enough of experts. This came to define the view of the anti-European side of the British Brexit referendum, but it's also true in Trump's America and in many other countries, I might say, including Italy, where Ricardo is from, that there's a kind of pervasive distrust of elite institutions of all forms. And that makes policy communications much, much harder. You know, if you don't trust the World Bank and you don't trust the IMF and you don't trust the central bank, you don't trust the Central Statistics Authority, you don't trust the World Health Organization, it's much, much harder to get many people to do what the government thinks is in their best interest. And that's particularly true in countries like the United States, where you have this extraordinary partisanship, probably true in Italy as well. I don't know about Kazakhstan, but this is an extraordinary graph, the one on the left, which showed the early stages of the pandemic outbreak and citizens' perceptions of how serious the pandemic would be. And what this graph shows you is that red states, those who like Donald Trump, didn't really think that the pandemic was serious, and blue states did think it was serious. And clearly this has very little to do with how serious the pandemic was in these particular states. It has everything to do with the fact that in a heavily politically polarized environment, people view the truth of what they see in the world through political and partisan lenses. And that, again, it just makes it much, much more difficult for politicians to speak to a whole nation when there are political divides of this sort. Now, not every country has partisan divides as deep as the United States, but some variant of this phenomenon in which people interpret facts in the world through a politically partisan lens, enhanced by social media, which we know tends to lead to people having communication, information bubbles in which they, you know, if you're left-wing, you have a left-wing Twitter feed, and if you're right-wing, you hang out on the right-wing bits of Facebook. So for these two reasons, the pervasive rise of new media and declines in social trust for good or ill, it's much more difficult for governments to use policy communication, and they have to think much more carefully and more innovatively about the way that they're doing, which platforms they're using, how you can try and reach citizens in a way that they're not going to reject, all sorts of new considerations which are much more difficult. So that's the sort of the first part of what I wanted to say. And now I want to just have a look at some interesting examples of what happened here in Asia. But the title of my talk this evening also, in addition to wearing a mask, I also talked about the problems of fake news. And it's worth thinking about this, that COVID-19 is not merely the first global pandemic that we've seen for nearly a century, but it's the first outbreak of a disease like this that has happened in the age of social media. And that comes with particular problems of online disinformation. The World Health Organization called this managing the infodemic, meaning that there's a whole component, instead of just having to worry about washing your hands and wearing a mask and getting people to stay inside, there's a whole component of what happens during the pandemic, which is simply to do with trying to stop people spreading nonsense on the internet and the damaging effects that that can have, and how difficult it is to do that. The OECD had an interesting report about this recently, where they talked about the difference between misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation. But in that report, they had some research which showed that nearly all of these categories of information that is not accurate end up being spread by social media. That social media, you know, has many good sides, but has significant challenges for public policymakers, given its propensity to spread false information. So that's a downside. I think the upside is that there has been, for public policymakers, there's been a clear distinction almost from the beginning of the pandemic between the leading nations, most of whom have long-term evidence-based, technocratically capable governments. And I'm thinking here of the obvious candidates, many of whom are in East Asia: Taiwan, South Korea, New Zealand, Germany to some degree. You know, these are the kind of the acknowledged leaders in the kind of pandemic management. But it has also been true that the countries that have done well in managing the pandemic also tend to have been some of the countries that have done well in developing communication strategies about the pandemic, that this is sort of part of a piece, that capable governments have also been good at communicating well with their citizens. And that's partly because those governments have tended to have a basis of trust. Trust has been one of the most important factors in trying to figure out if you can get your citizens to do what they want. So this chart shows you perceptions of trustworthiness in the coronavirus outbreak, and you can see at the bottom, I don't think Kazakhstan is on here. I'm sort of looking to see if I can see it. But you can see, you know, many of the countries you'd expect there. Singapore right at the very bottom, but right at the very top, as it were. But Denmark, Germany, Norway, Canada, Sweden, the sort of kind of countries that traditionally tend to be very well run and have done quite well during the pandemic, also tend to have high levels of public trust. And that's immensely helpful in if you have a preceding high level of public trust, it makes it much easier to do the kind of communication. And that explains a good chunk of why Singapore was able to move from its policy of everyone must not wear a mask to everyone must wear a mask. But the more interesting thing, I think, is what's happened in Asia more broadly, or at least in East Asia, because it isn't just that these Asian economies have become quite innovative, it's that they've moved very substantially from a previous record in which many of them have mishandled pandemics before, or early pandemics. So most of these diseases, or many of them, emanate from East Asia. So if you think about the SARS outbreak in the early 2000s, or even Middle East respiratory syndrome in 2015, they all affected countries like Taiwan, China, South Korea, Singapore, and many of the governments were very heavily criticized during those times for hiding information. And then you can see the report on the right of your screen from the New York Times, talking about how South Korea hid the severity of the MERS outbreak in 2015. And so what's interesting this time around is that governments in Asia have actually been very open, perhaps with the exception of China in the early stages of the pandemic. All of the best countries have distinguished themselves by, to my knowledge, nobody has been accused of any cover-ups. All of the public authorities have been very open with data on the extent of the pandemic, about the actions that they're taking. There have been very few examples in this part of the world of governments sort of trying to hide what's going on. And you compare that to poor performers, a country like Brazil, which literally decided to stop reporting its COVID statistics once they reached a certain point of severity. And of course, if you don't have reliable statistics about what's going on, then it's basically impossible to work out how to fix things. So that has been a big change, that governments in Asia have, in a broad sense, been very open about the nature of the problem. I'll talk about innovations in a minute. And that compares with the traditionally admired Anglo-Saxon world, so the United Kingdom, where I'm from, the United States, who've been heavily criticized for the rather shambolic nature of their public communications. So 2 examples on your screen here. Boris Johnson's shambolic coronavirus communication have angered millions and probably undermined compliance, meaning that people will not do what the government wants because they're either confused or they disagree with what the government's saying. So we're not going to stay indoors, we're not going to wear masks, whatever it might be. And the same is true obviously for Donald Trump, whose communication style during the pandemic has been pretty lamentable. And you can see the effect of this in the United Kingdom. So look at that bar in the middle shows public trust in the government over really, I mean, just a 6-week period, or a 5 or 6 week period in the height of the pandemic in April and May, when the UK government was really in a big mess and had a scandal over it, the way that it was communicating. And public trust dropped from 67% to 48%, which is a staggering change over such a short period of time. Very, very unusual to see a kind of change of that magnitude over slightly more than a month in terms of the way that people were viewing the government. So that's the kind of big picture, which is that many Asian nations which were once secretive have been quite open, and many of the Western nations that were seen as leaders have been much less good. And if you drill down a little bit into some of these Asian countries, you see some really interesting examples of what they've done well. So Taiwan is my favorite example. I mean, its record on COVID has been better than almost anywhere in the world. And it's done lots of things right over the course of the pandemic. So it started out with doing very regular communication, old-fashioned communication. So every day, this gentleman in the middle, Mr. Chen, who is the country's healthcare minister, he would have a 2 p.m. briefing at the height of the pandemic. These pulled in hundreds of thousands of viewers. He happens to be a health expert as well as a health minister. So he knows his epidemiology. He became a very trusted figure. And he was the one every day who was telling people what is happening in the pandemic, what are we going to do, what happens next, providing information in a way that people could trust. Actually, one of the things I'll mention here is that, you know, there's a balance to be struck in all of this communication between old media and new. Old media still matters a lot, even if we tend to focus on new media. And so Taiwan has also, you know, it's used the full suite. It lots of television adverts. It's used text messages, to sending kind of text message bursts to mobile phone users in particular. Geographies where there were COVID outbreaks in the early days of the pandemic, all sorts of things. But what really marks it out, and this gets back to this question of the dog, which I'll show you in a minute, is a very innovative approach to social media. So in Taiwan, that means Facebook, which is the dominant platform. And so they have communicated very effectively. In the middle there, you see holding the funny green thing, that's the Prime Minister, Tsai Ing-wen. And so the government has been very effective in the way that it has used Facebook in particular to get out basic messages about basic health and public information messages. And they've done this in particular by using humor. So here is the spokes dog. That they have, all of the adverts have this spokes dog. The dog has become the kind of the mascot of the COVID campaign. People in Taiwan seem to really like this dog. He's pretty cute. Anyway, so this one tells you need to wash your hands. You can see the minister again holding up images with the same dog. And so a kind of an innovative approach to content that is shareable and provides public health messages. But Taiwan has also been interesting in its use of public data. So the woman on the left is Audrey Tang, very fascinating public servant. She is the Taiwanese digital minister, the first, to my knowledge, transgender minister in this part of the world. And so she's a real innovator. She describes herself as a conservative anarchist. I can go into what that means if you want. Ricardo is now raising his eyebrows. So she has this whole sort of libertarian philosophy about technology, but she's also pioneered a whole bunch of very innovative policies about the provision of open public data. So the map in the middle was an app that was developed off Taiwan's public data system, which allowed you to find out where you could get masks early in the pandemic when there were shortages of masks. And this was government data, which was put out there openly online, and third parties could come along and develop apps off the back of it. And so this has actually been one of the things that has marked out Asia's approach to the pandemic, has been innovation with public data. So you can see this particularly in Hong Kong and South Korea. This is the Hong Kong dashboard of COVID-19 cases. So you can go down to the level of a building and see where COVID cases have happened. Just to give you a kind of sense of, do you live in an area where there have been COVID cases? Should you therefore then take precautions? Providing citizens with useful information that they can then look at. South Korea has taken this a step further, a step that some countries might not want to take for privacy reasons, but this is the Corona 100 app. And what that does is when anyone gets COVID, the authorities interview them and find out where they've been, and then they put that information on a map so that anyone can see the literal paths that anyone who had COVID has walked through areas of town. So you can find out if you were at the same mall, if you're on the same street, and then the app will give you advice as to whether or not you need to self-isolate because of that. So that approach comes with privacy issues that other countries may not want to repeat, but it's an interesting example of what you can do with public data. And it's been immensely popular in South Korea, which again has had a very good record on COVID and getting people to do what you want them to do. Let me just have a look at my time here. Okay, 5 minutes to go. That's good. Other countries have pioneered other methods of communication. So this is one that we in Singapore know about every day because we've all signed up to the gov.sg WhatsApp platform. And so WhatsApp is now the dominant way in which Singapore gets information to its citizens. And so every day, twice a day, you get a message from the government. That's from the 8th of June, so it's not the one from last week, but and it tells you what has happened in the pandemic that day. You know, have there been any new cases, and if not, and if they have, then who are they, and what's the sort of status of the pandemic? So you get that update at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and from time to time you also get kind of public health messages telling you what the government is doing at this particular moment. And this was more vital and urgent in the early stages of the pandemic when people were really worried about things. It's at the moment in Singapore, there are almost no cases anymore. And so people are paying less attention to this because they're not so worried. But you can see on the right there, the kind of messaging that they would put out. In the middle of the pandemic, when lots and lots of rumors were flying around, this was the kind of thing that they would send out. So they would use this WhatsApp group to combat fake news. So they would find out that there were sort of untrue reports were being circulated on social media, and they put these out as the kind of official line from the government. So the top one there says there are false rumors circulating that safe distancing ambassadors, those are the people in Singapore whose job it is to wander around the streets and tell you if you're not social distancing or you're not wearing your mask. And it says there are rumors that the social distancing ambassadors are imposing fines. And the fact is that they don't impose fines. They're not allowed to do that. So that was a kind of example of fake news, almost real-time fake news rebuttal coming out from the Singapore government, and much more effective. You can find these things on the Singapore government website, but nobody ever goes to the Singapore government website. It's vastly more effective to have this delivered to your WhatsApp, which is what everybody uses here for communication day to day, and probably the same in Kazakhstan. So let me just talk, the final thing that I wanted to talk about was to talk about these sort of dilemmas that governments face. So in a sense, what I've done is I've talked a little bit about why public communications has got harder, that problems of trust and technology, and given you some examples of innovations from this part of the world. And I now just want to sort of talk about the problems that people have been thinking about in trying to work out how to develop innovative public communication strategies. And as I said, so countries like Singapore, going back to this thing about the masks, it's not that they've got everything right. I mean, lots of countries, as I said at the beginning, have struggled with this. It's that they've been able to adapt as they go along and bring people with them. So even if you have a change as dramatic as the one that we had in Singapore, in which you went from nobody should wear a mask to everybody should wear a mask, then a combination of the underlying social trust in the system, but also the way that the government has communicated, has been able to kind of persuade people that these changes are the right thing to do. So how has it done that? I mean, there's been a balance to be struck between old media and new in their communication style. So, I mean, one of the most important things that happened in Singapore, as in most countries, I imagine, has been addresses from the Prime Minister. So from time to time during the pandemic, the government would decide, okay, so now we need the Prime Minister to speak to the nation. And in the early stages in March and April had an almost wartime feel to it, where, once every week or two, the Prime Minister would sort of talk on live television and everybody would watch. And actually Mr. Lee in Singapore is a very effective, calm, reasonable communicator in a way that somebody like Donald Trump, for instance, isn't. But that clearly using older forms of media has been important, but also trying to work out how to innovate using newer forms of media like the Singapore WhatsApp group. As I say, a calm tone has not always been the way that many politicians have approached this crisis. I mean, if you look at this, has been the era of kind of Chinese wolf warrior diplomacy and Donald Trump on his Twitter account. So there are plenty of ways in which politicians and political leaders can make these problems worse in the tone that they use. But I think it's notable that the best countries, or many of the best countries, have used a tone of communication that is calm, informative, evidence-based. Angela Merkel, I mean, you'll notice that many of the leaders of these countries happen to be female, and you can draw your own conclusions from that. But I mean, Angela Merkel has won a lot of plaudits for the style of her communication and her ability to try and explain the science behind COVID in a way that is clear, rational, and evidence-based. And I think Prime Minister Lee in Singapore has tried to do the same thing. I think it's fair to say that it's not yet clear how effective the governments have been at pushing back against online misinformation. This remains a work in progress. So I showed you a technique that Singapore has tried to use. There's not really much evidence that this works, or at least in a sense, you're really pushing back against the tide of online misinformation. It's very, very hard to stop this at source. And so that's a dilemma that you face that I'll talk about in a minute. A couple of others to talk about. I mean, one is when I used to work for the British Prime Minister, we used to talk about the need to have a high level narrative for the government, what was often called the strategic clothesline. And this was the idea of the central narrative that the government had about itself, onto which you would peg any other kind of announcements that you were making. And that central narrative was often something very basic, like the government is on your side, or the government is trying to develop an economy that works for you. And in the case of the pandemic, you know, governments need to try and figure out how to come up with a long-term strategy which shows that they are in control of events and that they're doing what's in the best interests of the public. But they need to do that while balancing with the much more tactical day-to-day firefighting of managing a news environment in the pandemic. In order to talk about this, I called the Singaporean civil servant who is in charge of doing this at the Ministry of Communication and Information, whose name is Aaron Maniam, that's him on the right. And so he talked about there being 5 dilemmas that the government in Singapore had struggled with during the pandemic, a couple of which I've already mentioned. The balance between digital and analog was one. The balance between communication that could be real time, but communication like an address from the Prime Minister that provided a real point of stability, even something as simple as having a WhatsApp message that came out at the same time every day, so that citizens got used to it, so that it became a kind of thing that they could rely on. Balancing communication that was simply informational with something that had an emotive edge was another thing that he mentioned. So you see on the advert on the right-hand side there, the idea that everyone should do their part, that you should be protecting others, things that are designed to sort of trigger your instincts of good citizenship. The bottom, countering fake news, but not actively stoking panic. So that's the problem, that if you spend all of your time responding to individual bits of fake news, you can actually perversely create a sense of panic. But the bigger one is what I wanted to conclude on, really, which I think is this central dilemma that governments face in the new era of what I would call radical transparency and also uncertainty, which is this tension between openness and authority. So on the one hand, governments now have the capacity to be very open about their decision-making, much more so than they have been in the past. But the problem is that particularly in situations like this, you can only be so open. In the pandemic, as I say, governments don't really know how severe, at least at the start of it, governments didn't know how severe it was. They didn't know how quickly it was going to spread. They didn't know when there was going to be a vaccine. The list of things that they didn't know was, could have filled a whole book. The problem was you couldn't admit all of the things you didn't know, because it would make you look as if you were completely out of control of events. But on the other hand, you couldn't claim that you knew everything because that would be implausible. And so trying to strike this balance between admitting that there were elements of uncertainty, as the Singaporean Prime Minister here tried to do in his early address in February, saying nobody knows how long the pandemic will last, but not appearing to be completely clueless, is an incredibly difficult balance. And it's made much more difficult by the nature of our modern media environment. And so I think that that dilemma is really the thing that governments have to try and manage. So that's it. That's what I wanted to say. So to recap, sort of three main arguments. All governments have struggled to develop these effective pandemic communication strategies. That's true of the best governments like Taiwan and New Zealand. It's true of the worst like the UK and America. You can look to many Asian states for examples of innovation in a way that perhaps wouldn't have been true 10 years ago when we more traditionally have looked at Western countries. And in an era of radical transparency, we still have to try and grapple with this balance between being more open, which in many ways has been a wise strategy during the pandemic, and some of the best countries have been the most open, while also trying to ensure that you preserve public trust and your sense of authority. I think the final thing that I'd say is that whatever happens as we go through the next stages of the pandemic, hopefully we get a vaccine, we try to manage some return to normality. Public communications is going to be a vital component of any effective strategy, and probably much more so than many of you watching will have given credit for. That really solving this pandemic, public communications is not a peripheral task. It is core to how you try and get to the other side of this pandemic, and therefore something that we all need to pay much more attention to. So that's it. Thank you very much. If you want to keep in touch with me, you can add me on LinkedIn or follow me on Twitter, or sort of whatever you want to do. But thank you very much for having me, and I'm very happy to now have a discussion with Ricardo or answer any questions that you have.
Thanks, James. It was a very interesting presentation, and I think we can now ask our participants to ask you directly some questions. I don't want to steal any time, except for saying that I think I'm one of the few people that actually wrote about anarcho-conservatives, though I was talking about anarcho-conservatives in Europe from Prezzolini to Dietze, and I was not aware you have anarcho-conservatives in East Asia. So, that's why I was raising my eyebrow. That's all. Okay, the floor is open. Okay, question. I've heard about the news on social media about the vaccine and the 5G technology and Bill Gates. How can the people can check this information? Is it fake or not?
Yes, it's absolutely fake. It's a very, very good example of what I'm talking about, the difficulty of this communication environment where you have all sorts of insane conspiracy theories. And yeah, I mean, even in the United Kingdom, my home country, you've had people attacking 5G base stations. And as you say, that there's also this very weird conspiracy theory about Bill Gates, the man who has done almost single-handedly more than anyone else on earth to invest money in public health solutions and to invest money in the pandemic. I mean, has invested billions of dollars. And somehow there's this completely crackpot idea that he is responsible in some sense for what's happening. And a lot of very, kind of educated, reasonable people have come to believe these kind of things, partly because of the media environments in which they now operate in which people have less exposure to trusted media sources and much more exposure to social media sources, but also because these conspiracy theories they have a kind of element of plausibility to them that tap into people's insecurities. So if you are of a disposition in which you think that the public authorities are lying to you in some sense, you've had bad experiences with public authorities and you don't really trust them, or you think that rich people manipulate the system for their own benefits, which is a perfectly reasonable point of view and nothing to do with, nothing wrong with that. That's quite accurate. Then many of these conspiracy theories, be it Gates or 5G or the American Q conspiracy theory, they have these sort of elements within them. They're kind of 90% nonsense, but there's 10% which sounds almost plausible, and so people get sucked into them because the people who make them up are kind of plausible con artists. And these things have always existed, but I think they're more prevalent now, particularly in the West, than they used to be, and that's because, at least partly because of the kind of things that I was talking about, changing social media environment and declining trust in traditional forms of authority.
James, one of our PhD students, Abhikesh Mukhtarova, is asking you, some social media explain the success of Asian countries in beating COVID by cultural differences, obedience to authority, for example. In your view, does cultural context, norms, tradition plays the role in beating the pandemic?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's a very difficult question to answer, because if you're not careful, then you get into kind of, I'm not suggesting your questioner is in this position, but it's quite easy to get into kind of ethnic and racial stereotypes in which, you know, we view East Asians as somehow kind of obedient and doing what their government says, as opposed to, you know, free-spirited Americans or Italians or Northern Europeans. And it's hard to, that's not where I would go first, I suppose, in trying to see why East Asia has done well during the pandemic. I would look at the nature of their governing systems, the fact that they have well-resourced healthcare systems. They tend to be run by technocrats as opposed to populists. You know, that they're innovative. These are also societies that are highly technologically enabled, and therefore now even more so than the societies in the West, they tend to be places that technological innovation happens first. That said, I suspect at some level that there's an element of truth in the fact that some Asian societies have attitudes to authority that is simply different from Northern Europe or America. And that, again, to some degree, that may make the task of public communications a little bit easier, but I don't have any data on that. And as I say, I'm a little bit wary of looking to those explanations first, because there is a risk that it simply degrades quite quickly into sort of trading onto cultural stereotypes. So I think there's some element of that is probably true. I don't have data on it, but it's not where I would look for my first explanation as to why a country like Taiwan has done well during the pandemic. I think it's hard to look at the record in Taiwan and think that somehow sort of social obedience and Confucian theories of the state are why Taiwan has managed to beat this pandemic so successfully. I think it's much more to do with the fact that Taiwan has an exceptionally effective government. It has very good political leadership. It has a strong record of kind of democratic innovation and all sorts of other things that I would look to first.
James, Professor Omer Barish wants to ask you a question. Omer, please go ahead.
Hello, James. It's good to see you.
Hi, Omar. How are you?
Good. How are you? First of all,
very good.
Thank you very much for a very interesting, very timely presentation. I enjoyed it very much. I have one question, especially at the beginning of the presentation. You took us back to 6-7 months ago, and my question is concerned a little bit about the secondary effects or the tertiary effects of those episodes. I remember I tried to Google it, but I couldn't find it. An article in New York Times, especially pointing out the discrepancy in the government recommendation against masks at that time. They strictly advised not buying the masks because they were not helpful. And then at the same time, the reasoning was based a little bit on, if you buy all of them, then the healthcare workers will not find them. Then an immediate conclusion in that article, which I found very interesting, was if they were not helpful or beneficial, why would healthcare workers need it at the first place? So the government actually jeopardized its own statement about whether the masks work or masks do not work. Now, and when the tone of those kind of statements provides you full confidence, and in just a matter of 2 weeks, you immediately switch from no, masks are not helpful to everyone should wear masks. How do those kind of switches affect of the overall messages? You gave examples of successful communication by Eastern governments, or like in the Far East, but in the West, how the secondary or tertiary effects of those kind of switches and 100% confidence in their recommendations affected the credibility of those messages. And at the end, in most of the countries, we failed in the allocation of toilet papers. Now we are trying to achieve the efficient allocation of information and the vaccines, hopefully. How would you evaluate the effects of those episodes in current information problem?
Yeah, I don't think it's a great question. It's why I picked that example, because I didn't want to hold, sort of Singapore or South Korea or Japan as these sort of perfect examples. Like, all of them have made mistakes. Everybody has made mistakes in managing this thing. It's an incredibly complicated policy challenge in all sorts of respects. And so even the best countries have, done all sorts of things wrong. But what interested me, so you're exactly right, that was the story in Singapore. Part of the reason I think that they said everybody shouldn't wear a mask is the evidence was unclear, and indeed it remains unclear if your evidential standard is, sort of double-blind trial, large scale tests. We still don't really know. I mean, as far as I'm aware, we still don't really know for absolutely certain how effective masks are, although there have been more research done over the last few months. So on the one hand, the evidence wasn't clear, as it often isn't. You have to make a decision on the basis of unclear evidence. And B, they were worried about panic buying and stockpiling. And so, as you say, this didn't quite make sense at a sort of basic sniff test level, which was, if all of the medical practitioners wear masks, then why would they bother doing that if there was no evidence that they didn't make any use? So at a kind of very basic level, that there was a sort of logic which suggests that actually masks were probably a good idea, because that's why medical professionals wear PPE. But the Singapore government, I think, to be fair to them, was trying to strike a balance. But as you say, the effect was that they really, I think what they were worried about was sort of everyone rushing out and panic buying, and therefore there being none left for anyone else. And so critics have said that was disingenuous. But I suppose what I found interesting was how they managed to negotiate that transition, and partly because they have since admitted that this was a mistake. So the Prime Minister sort of came out and said, actually, we probably shouldn't have done this. This wasn't the best way to explain what was going on. But in part because the government had a reasonable level of social trust, they were able to make this transition, really quite dramatic change in policy advice, effectively and in a way that other countries didn't manage to do, and kind of were seen to be much more shambolic. And that was partly, I think, because you had this, endowment of high trust from voters, but also because of the effective way that they communicated it. There are definitely other countries that have executed similar changes in policy who have been much more harshly criticized. I mean, one advantage that you have in Singapore is you have a reasonably, you don't have a very aggressive media, let me put it that way. Whereas in the UK and in Europe, often the newspapers and the media ecosystem will go after the government if they're perceived to be being inconsistent, and that doesn't happen here to the same extent. So that's also another advantage. That has some downsides within the Singaporean system, but it's an advantage in these moments that it's easier to execute changes of policy without everyone starting throwing rotten tomatoes at you and saying that you're useless.
Thanks, James. We have a question from Dinara asking, what kind of changes in public policy we're going to see after deepfake technology?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I don't know if this is the same Dinara who's in my class, but if it is, then I'll give her a wave. I haven't seen any examples of deepfakes during the pandemic, or none that have kind of really caught the national imagination. So far, at least, this has not been a major problem. So you haven't, for instance, that I've seen, had videos of Bill Gates circulating saying that he wants to kill all your children, or that he has a kind of malicious plan to infect the whole world with COVID-19, made up videos to that effect. But when you look at the deep fakes, I mean, it simply adds an extra layer of complexity to what is already a horribly difficult problem of media management. And it's a problem of media management with no real good answer. I mean, I think that was my ultimate conclusion about fake news during the pandemic, is that some governments have got, they've got much better at trying to handle fake news. They have new legislation, some of it quite heavy-handed. It's true in Asia as well. They have new tools like the WhatsApp group that I talked to you about. And they certainly have a greater appreciation that this is a problem both that is generated indigenously, just bubbles up from within, and also in some countries, a problem that is developed maliciously by state actors, thinking, and not least of your neighbors to the north, countries that will come along and attempt to deliberately spread misinformation in other people's media ecosystems in order to create problems amongst their publics. So there's reasonably good evidence that some of the information about vaccines, for instance, that circulates on social media comes from other state actors. So I think that the question was about deep fakes, but you have these sort of three things that governments have tried to do: new legislative powers, new tools, and a new sense of awareness. And yet still, it's incredibly hard. The volume of fake information cannot be managed by human beings. You have to try and manage this algorithmically. The social media platforms, they try to do this, but they're always slow. They don't put enough resources into this problem. And so even now, I think the kind of even the best governments are struggling. And so yes, deep fakes and who knows what else will emerge as problems. I mean, actually, probably the bigger problem at the moment is privatized fake news. So previously it used to be that fake news existed in a kind of semi-public form. It was on Facebook or it was on Twitter. You could see it to some degree out there in the public sphere. But the real problem now are the private social networks like WhatsApp on my phone, where fake news that circulates on WhatsApp is much less visible to the public authorities. So it's much harder to find out what's actually going on than it is, for instance, on Twitter, where at least on Twitter, everyone can see, who's a bot and who isn't a bot, and you've got a kind of public record. And so the trend in social media, which is towards more encrypted private spaces that are not open to the wider public, actually makes this problem much worse. And so there are more immediate problems, I think, than something like deep fakes that we should be worried with, that have made managing the pandemic much more complicated.
James, we have two final questions. Anara Sheikhanova wants to know whether fines were used by governments against fake news. And Dr. Abhishek wonders whether this the perception of health issues were always influenced by political considerations, or whether what's happening now with the COVID is the first time that there's such a polarization between, let's say, Republicans and Democrats.
Yeah, well, so governments Singapore has been a kind of pioneer in developing these new legislative powers for fake news, and so it certainly now has all sorts of powers if it wants to I don't actually can't remember the legislation, but I'm sure it must be able to fine people if they don't do what they say. That the particular sort of act that they have allows the Singapore government to identify a claim as being fake, and then the person who has made that claim must put a retraction. And so it's particularly aimed at something like Facebook. Let's say you post something on Facebook that turns out to be false. Typically, you can keep it up on Facebook, but it has to then have a retraction on it saying, you know, the Singapore government says this isn't accurate, and here's what the Singapore government says. Quite similar now to what happens on Twitter, where Donald Trump's tweets almost always now have that little bar underneath them saying, you know, this thing the president has just said is complete rubbish, or words to that effect. So you do have these tools, but the problem is they're not even those that were seen to be quite heavy-handed are used very sparingly. I mean, if you think about the billions and billions of messages that are floating around social media platforms every day, then the ability of governments to kind of find ones that are particularly problematic and then go through some administrative process where you end up putting a warning or a fine. They're really only going to use these tools in very select cases. And so, yes, it is possible to find people, but that's not ultimately an effective strategy. Much, much more effective strategies get down to the architectural level of the social media platforms themselves. So really the single most effective strategy to stop the spreading of fake news over the last few years has been WhatsApp's decision to limit the virality of content. So you now can only send messages to 5 people if you try and forward them in most parts of WhatsApp. And that had a very dramatic effect on the ability of fake news to spread, because they made it more difficult for you to spread content at the level of what the platform allowed you to do. And so really, if you're going to sort of check the spreading of fake news, then you need those kind of deeper structural fixes to the way the platforms operate. But of course, problematically, those push against often the financial incentives of the platforms themselves. So that's a much bigger tension that no one has yet worked out how to solve. The question about polarization is an interesting one. I mean, long-standing. You know, there have always been, we as human beings see the world in light of our polarized preferences. And so, you know, if you are a supporter of, you know, Vladimir Putin, you're likely to see his actions in a way that is different from if you're not a supporter of Vladimir Putin or Angela Merkel or Boris Johnson or Prime Minister Lee in Singapore. What's happened, however, over recent years in many countries, and most notably the United States, is just partisanship has divided much more starkly. So it used to be that in the United States, for instance, you know, the most left-wing Democrat and the most right-wing Democrat and the most left-wing Republican kind of overlapped in the middle, that there was a sort of space in the middle of politics that you know, Democrats and Republicans could kind of intermingle. And now that's not really true anymore. There's a big gap between the parties and their supporters. And so it's always been the case that there's been this ideological component to the way that we look at the world. We look at the world through ideological kind of political eyes. We don't look at the world neutrally. But that in many countries has just got a lot worse over the last 10 or 20 years. And I think social media is a big part of that. I mean, I was in my younger days, a big enthusiast for the democratic potential of new technologies. And I think the older that I've got, the longer the record is, you know, the more problematic these technologies have clearly become. And so social media has obviously played a big part in driving this polarization. It's also to do with trends in globalization and inequality and all sorts of other things, but social media has kind of clearly played a role in that. And it's something that all governments, including Kazakhstan, I'm sure, will have to grapple with as we move forward. So,
James, are you willing to take one more question?
Sure, yeah, go ahead.
Enrique, do you want to ask the question?
Yes, I would like to. Thank you very much. James, thanks a lot for your interesting presentation. I am from Nazarbayev University Library. And my question to you, James, there is a term, social distancing. Do you think it is correct term? Maybe it's better to use the term physical distancing. Thank you.
It's an interesting question. The language that people use can have a big effect on take-up. So I haven't thought about social distancing. But for instance, there's been quite a lot of interesting reflection using tools of behavioral science and behavioral insights to try and think about how you do public health messages during the pandemic. I didn't talk about this. It's a very interesting part of the kind of public communications challenge. So for instance, it's much more effective to tell people to wear a mask to protect other people than it is to protect themselves, because that kind of public spiritedness and reciprocity turns out to be a more effective communication strategy. So if you're trying to get people to wear a mask and you say, well, you might get hurt, well, you might get the disease, then people will kind of calculate for themselves, well, is it very likely that I'm going to get it? And they might decide it's not very likely, so I won't bother. But if you tell them it's their duty to protect the elderly and the vulnerable, then they're much more likely to wear it. The same is true when you're trying to communicate things like, should you stay at home, or should you be careful when you go outside, which are kind of different ways of saying the same thing. And actually it turns out to be more effective to tell people to sort of stay at home and stay safe, because that's something that kind of appeals to our sense of loss aversion, you know, sort of staying safe is something that, but so social distancing, in a funny way, that phrase has been around right since the beginning of the pandemic, and it hasn't changed. I've heard people suggest other phrases that might be more effective, but I haven't really thought too much about what those might be and why. But it is certainly the case that the individual words and phrases that you use can have a big effect on whether or not people intuitively agree with them or not. So social distancing, social protecting, I mean, there are all sorts of different ways in which you might decide to kind of use that same idea.
Thank you, James. On behalf of GSPP, on behalf of all the participants, I would like to thank you for a brilliant presentation, for talking to our participants and to give us some insight about the fake news, ending with information and a variety of very interesting issues. Thank you so much.
That's great. It's very nice to be here. One of these days, I hope to make it to Kazakhstan. I haven't made it yet, but I was going to come last year and then I didn't manage. But don't think I'm going to come in November. I think I'm going to go. People tell me sort of September is the time to come, so I'll try for that. So
the best season to come here is between December and March.
Really? I thought it was 40 below.
It is the best season to enjoy the real Astana, Nur Sultan.
No. Okay, thank you very much, everyone.
Right, thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you very much.
The best. Night, night.